So welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Welcome to this virtual roundtable on thinking about global security. My name is Dr. Annette Idler. I'm the director of the Global Security Programme at Pembroke College and also a faculty member here at the Blavatnik School of Government. First of all, I would like to express my thanks to the DT Institute, which provides generous support for the series. Also to the Blavatnik School of Government and Pembroke College here at Oxford. And I'd also like to thank my team, especially Frederick, who was instrumental in setting all of this up here, and also Kate and Tanya, Talia, and Beatrice. I see we now have everyone in the virtual room. That's great. So we see Elizabeth has been able to join us as well. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you yet, but we can hear you. That's fantastic. Great.
Great.
We are just starting with a webinar right now. But before we begin, before we come to the actual conversation, I would like to acknowledge the victims of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, who are, of course, all on our minds right now. This is a terrible natural disaster, and of course it has occurred in territory where people had already suffered immensely from the repercussions of more than a decade of civil war in a region of also instability. I also would like to acknowledge the victims of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which began almost exactly 1 year ago. I'm sure the Munich Security Conference this week will deal with the immediate pressures of these and related development in current affairs, and we might touch upon this also a little bit here in our discussion. But primarily in the webinar today, we would like to contextualize such events and look a little bit, stand back and look at the bigger picture. So with this roundtable, we launch an exciting webinar series on global security that runs through the second half of Hillary term and the first half of Trinity term. And for those unfamiliar with this Oxford speech, that means for the next 4 weeks, and then again another 4 weeks after the spring break. Now, the purpose of this webinar series is to explore the meaning and practice of global security. And the term global security is often used as a label for pretty much anything related to security. It's also often used interchangeably with international security. Now, our goal here is to think about global security in a more precise way, if that is possible at all. I mean, I would also like to keep this as a question here, so that it helps us identify pathways that are useful to tackle the global security challenges that the world is facing. And this intellectual effort forms part of our research program on global security here at Oxford. In this research, we study how local contested spaces, transnational illicit flows, and shifts in global order influence each other, and how these interactions may lead to threats to global security. Now, we focus on a number of key elements to theorize and think about global security. And this is also how we have structured the webinar series. So next week, for example, we discuss methodologies and epistemologies in global security to reflect that understanding global security requires embracing diversity in our approaches to studying it. In the following week, we'll be examining spaces and scales in global security to consider how global security manifests itself across different scales, ranging from the local to the global and across physical and non-physical spaces. We then move on to consider how global security emerges from the dynamic interactions of 3 dimensions. First of all, the political dimension, and by that I mean primarily global order and geostrategic power. Secondly, the economic dimension, that is the networks of transnational supply chains, both licit and illicit ones. And then also the social dimensions, which refers here to the local experiences of stability or instability. So the sessions 4 to 7 of the webinar series focus on each of these dimensions and on how we need to understand the ways in which they interact dynamically, which also lies at the core of my own research. And then finally, we'll conclude the series with a closing roundtable on the future of global security. In each session, we bring together distinguished academics with policymakers or practitioners from around the world to make sure that our intellectual engagement helps tackle real-world security challenges. And of course, we are also interested in hearing from our audience members. And that's why we would like to ask those who are with us right now with at this webinar to respond to a quick poll, if we can make it happen. This is now the big surprise about the technology. Yes, I think it appears now on everyone's screen. We would just quickly like to ask, in your opinion, what is the most important issue area in global security in this century? So not necessarily right now in this moment, but in the century. And while we're waiting for the results, people might still want to think about this, I would just like to introduce our distinguished guests today. I think I couldn't wish for better speakers than those who join me today for this opening roundtable to set the scene for the series. So I'd like to welcome Professor Amitav Acharya from American University in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome Professor Deborah Aron from the University of Denver. Thanks so much for getting up so early. I'd also like to welcome Professor Pinar Bilgin from Bilkent University, Dr. Elizabeth Joyce from the United Nations Security Council Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, and Sir Adam Roberts from the University of Oxford. Now, it would take definitely more than the hour that we have available to list all the achievements of our speakers and all the relevant work that they've all produced on global security. I therefore would like to encourage the audience to read the bios that we've also included on the websites so that we can start right away with our conversation and really think about global security. Let's just quickly have a look at the result of our poll. So we see here that 41%, well, it's changing still, but let's say around 40% think that geopolitical competition is the most important issue area. Only around 4% think the economic crisis are important. Around 11% think that social crisis are most important. Around 38 refer to environmental issues, and then there are 10 that are others. So it's actually quite diverse, I would say, which perhaps also reinforces the need for a holistic approach to global security, and not just think about it from one particular angle. Also, I'd just like to, again, highlight that we ask here for the biggest challenge in this century rather than right now. So we really want to put this also in a historical context. So I therefore would like to start with a question addressed to one of our distinguished guests here, Sir Adam Roberts. Adam, could you share with us, in your view, what do you think, how can we think about global security really in that historical context rather than just focused on the moment?
Yes, thank you very much for organizing this event. Yes, I think there's one view that I've come to because of my work on the history of international relations that is really going to be quite a deeply unpopular view, especially as I will express it very crudely now. But I think that one fundamental challenge to global security in the last century and in the present century is the collapse of empires. What happens when empires fold up? And I say it's unpopular because, of course, there are many respects in which we should be warmly welcoming the collapse of empires, many of which were too large, over-bureaucratized, militarily dangerous, and so on. But if you look at all the crises that we face, there's a real problem for the people involved as to what kind of state will replace the old empire that is being or has been abandoned, what its language is to be, what its religion is to be, what its type of government is to be, and more. It's a huge array of questions, and that's true as one significant factor in the origins of the wars in Yugoslavia. It's true equally of today, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. All of these issues have come up. And what strikes me most of all is that if you look through the list of UN peacekeeping operations in the whole period since the Second World War, all but possibly one of them have been to address post-colonial problems. They are genuinely difficult. And I say this not with any sense of Britain being superior. We are as responsible through the empire and the way it ended of causing a great deal of the problems that we're having to deal with still today. And moreover, Britain itself still has a post-colonial problem in the shape of Northern Ireland. And we have not exactly made a brilliant business of that. So my main view, I don't want to stress that this is a rival to other interpretations, and it's certainly not a rival to new threats that we have to consider, or we have threats that we have to take more seriously than in the past, especially environmental. So I'm not presenting this idea, this emphasis on post-colonial problems as a complete explanation, but rather as one factor that is pretty central to global security.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Adam. I'd like to turn to Deborah. We've now heard about the relevance of the collapse of empires, not necessarily of state competition itself, or not necessarily of just individuals, people. And that brings me to asking you how we can think about global security in relation to other concepts that might perhaps focus on states, particular, thinking about international security, or on individuals, on people, human security. In your view, what is global security, keeping in mind what Adam also just said, and how does it relate to concepts such as international security or human security, if there is such a distinct concept at all?
Yeah, thank you. I did have a moment when you said we were going to try to be precise. I'm going to encourage us not to be precise. I think that when I think about global security, it's really an all-encompassing concept. For my entire career, there's been a debate over how to think about security. I mean, at the very beginning of my dissertation, Jessica Tuckman-Matthews wrote about, sort of broadening security, and there was just this big kerfuffle all through the 90s about what security was. And I think we've come up with a lot of terms. And people have sort of retreated to their camps to talk about human security or national security or international security. And in my view, global security is a concept that allows us to, sort of erect an umbrella under which we can hang all of those concepts and hopefully encourage them to interact with one another. Just riffing off what Adam Roberts just said, I think many people would look at disorder as being threatening to the security of some. It's certainly threatening to the security of the advantaged. But I think a lot of the discussions that we've had over the course of certainly the last 10 or 15 years have really, unfurled a number of voices about the level to which they have felt insecure by the kinds of orders that are established. And I think, we see this in the United States right now, where, efforts to secure cities and states in the wake of what was seen as a terrorist threat has generated tremendous insecurity to many of our citizens. And I think that that's true in many parts of the world as well. And so I think that we've become much more attentive to the degree to which, order, which seems so orderly and nice, generates threats and insecurity to some. And so I think that global security by its nature is going to be evolving. And so we shouldn't be too precise. And it allows us to sort of understand these different ways that people feel security and insecurity in their lives.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Deborah. Now, you referred to order, which seems orderly, but actually can create threats. That also, I think, makes us think about what is underneath that order, right? What is it that we can see or detect? But then also, what is it that creates fear, that fuels fear among people? What are people's perceptions also of that order, right? That might look very orderly on the surface. Pinar, perhaps could you elaborate further from your perspective on maybe also how we can bring in the people into that picture and what you consider important here when we think about global security?
Okay, thank you. Very quick 3 points. One of them is about the referent of security, because the question seems to lead us in that direction. Individual security, human security, international security, global security. The first point that I'd like to make here is that global security, I don't think of it as about being the referent object of security, who or what security refers to, right? It's not about shifting the referent object. It's not about whose security we're prioritizing here. That's point number one. Point number two is I do not think of the global in global security only in terms of the space where security takes place. It's certainly about that, right? But not only about that. And you said this at the very beginning as well, more often than not, people, when they talk about global security, they talk about transnational issues, they talk about non-state actors, but almost always with reference to states and their own insecurities, without necessarily paying attention to all those people, right? All those other actors who also constitute the global, right? This perhaps feeds into the discussion that's been going on so far as well, whose insecurity that we're going to also listen when we're thinking about global security. So paying attention to the insecurities, concerns of people who also constitute the global. So it's not about shifting the referent object. It's also not just about the space. This is the third point, and I'm hoping that this is going to connect us to what Amitav has to say about this subject area as well. I think of the global in global security as an approach to thinking about security, right? And I may want to actually phrase this in terms of as thinking globally about security, right? We may be thinking globally about international security, we may be thinking globally about human security, but it's an approach to thinking about security. So it requires, the way I think about it, a reorientation approach. Okay, it's not about just turning to other people and ask them, so what do you think, right? It's about also reorienting our approach as we listen to them as well. And the way I think about it, this needs to be done from the ground up. Right, it needs to be a change in our sociological imagination as we approach the global, and our concepts require readjusting to thinking globally about security, so that we would be able to listen to them and hear them as they tell us about their insecurities. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Pinar. You already said that I think you do make the perfect link to our next speaker on referring also to the global as a approach. So I would like to turn now hand over to Amitav to ask, how can we think about the global in global security? And of course, also linking that to global international relations.
Thank you. I would like to start by saying one sort of overarching thought that I have about global security, and that has to do with the nature of security as a concept and how it has evolved to the present day. To say it in one word, it is the evolution of global security or emergence of global security is not a linear process. It has responded to both real world developments through the 1940s, World War II, to the present, but it also has responded to discourses, thinking about security, as Pinar pointed out. To me, security is like a elastic band. You can stretch it or contract it depending on your muscle power or your willpower. And let me just very quickly say how this happened. I mean, Deborah talked about Jessica Matthews' work on ecological security, redefining security. Now, before that, we had so security basically started as a national security concept. Security protecting your sovereignty and territorial integrity against external military threats. That was pretty much the American definition after World War II, and the creation of the US Defense Department and all this preceded that. But then in the after the oil crisis of the 70s, it acquired an economic dimension. In the 80s and 90s, when growing consciousness of ecological challenges sink in, it had an ecological dimension. Then in the 1990s and 2000s, with the end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the rise of ethno-national conflicts, transnational threats that don't respect national boundaries, such as climate change or demographics, drug trafficking, people smuggling, terrorism after 9/11 in particular. So security becomes much broader. And at the same time, as Adam pointed out, the post-colonial states, the entry of post-colonial states to the international system created another dimension of security. It was both spatial, but also issue-oriented. The security is not just about state security, but also internal security, the problem of weak states, the problem of regime security. Muhammad Ayyub's work becomes important. So this all leads to the 2000s, when we have the beginning of this idea of human security. Security is not for states, but for people. In fact, states can be also threats to their people's security. So we had humanitarian intervention discourses, responsible to protect discourses. So what I like to point out is that security became global. I mean, it's not just about national to interstate or international, spatially to acquiring a global dimension, including post-colonial states and their concerns, but also issue areas, not just about military or war, but also about environment, economics, demographics, and refugees and migrants alike. But what has happened now is a reversal. I think it's a great reversal, and what I call retrenchment, or what I call a global security paradox. In the last 5 to 10 years, the security has become narrowing again. And this is the result of first 9/11 attacks, although it is a global threat, it's a transnational threat, but actually a lot of the countries approach terrorism from a national security perspective, not from a global security perspective, and we can talk about it. Then the US-China trade war, breaking down the supply chains, breaking down interdependence. So that requires more of a national security consciousness. Then COVID pandemic, again, a threat to supply chains, talk about national self-reliance and undermining of global trade. That also narrows the concept of security. Ukraine is another one, Russia-Ukraine NATO war. I call it not Russia-Ukraine, but NATO is a real party to it. So it's Russia does Ukraine/NATO war. And that is also bringing back national security consciousness. War is back at the heart of Europe, which hadn't been the case for a long time. And the main drivers of this is alliances, or especially NATO, not the UN, not the European Union. So we are back to this national security mindset for that. And then there is an inefficacy of international institutions, like almost collapse of the WTO, WHO's problems during the pandemic, and now the stagnation and climate change talks. So security is contracting back to, maybe what it was in the 60s and 70s, or maybe slightly exaggerating it. So the bottom line is we have a global security paradox that many of the threats we face today are actually transnational. Actually, Ukraine, the COVID-19, and the US-China trade war proves that nations are interdependent. But the approach we're taking, the concept of security we're using, especially the countries with big muscles, is actually very narrow, back to kind of a national security mindset. So that's what I say.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Amitav. Elizabeth, I'd like to turn to you and maybe just pick up what Amitav was just saying about this return to national security, even though the threats are transnational. Now, of course, from the perspective of the United Nations, I mean, you need to think about member states, right? So we have a state perspective, and yet we are facing transnational threats. So what would you say from your perspective, also coming from the United Nations, working also on counterterrorism? What do you consider is most relevant here, and how would you link that to this unpacking of global security that we've just heard?
I suppose that given my background, I'm going to take a very prosaic policy approach to this and think about the means rather than the causes of this. For us, I won't say for us, I'll say for me, I'm representing only my own views here. For me, one of the most important challenges at the moment is new and emerging technologies, because they do integrate, I think, many of the concerns that have been raised here. I think that we at the Security Council has a focus on the problems associated with new and emerging technologies in terms of terrorism. And evidence of that is in October of last year, the Counterterrorism Committee managed to agree on an outcome document on this particular threat. They held a special meeting in Delhi. They issued the Delhi Declaration. All member states were invited there. And they focused on new and emerging technologies across the range of issues, from drones to recruitment. But for me personally, I think this goes further. I think that there are dangers. We're already seeing these manifested in many different ways that go beyond terrorism, that link to geopolitical competition, political crises, social crises, and even environmental crises. I think that it's an area that really we're just starting to explore. Although, as I say, the threats are already manifesting themselves in that respect. So I just wanted to draw attention to that to kick off.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Now that was an aspect, technologies, that was not mentioned by the other speakers. I'd be very curious to hear if the others have any thoughts on how we can fit that into thinking about global security. I mean, historically, of course, now we think about new technologies, perhaps with regards to the cyberspace, to the internet. But what is new, what constitutes new, of course, was something very different if we think about the historical context, including the collapse of empires. But also when it comes to perhaps what Pinar, what you mentioned about thinking not just about the states, but also for people. There are, of course, also new threats or new challenges connected to that. If we think about propaganda, if we think about how social media is also being used to fuel insecurity or perceptions of insecurity. And then also, Deborah, perhaps coming back to you in terms of the point about, well, we need to have these other concepts falling under global security. Would you consider technology then something that creates the need of another category, or how would you fit that into the existing ones? And then finally, Amitav, about your point going back to national security, how do you see these new means, the way that Elizabeth also framed it, right? Not necessarily as the cause, but as the means. Would that change the way we need to think about this return of national security considerations? So anyone who would like to go first of you, just unmute yourself. And I'd also just like to point to the audience that you can put questions in the Q&A chat, and I'll make sure to address them afterwards as well. Let's see. Deborah, would you like to go first?
Sure. So, you had asked us to be prepared to talk about what we thought to be the major security threats. And I was going to be very provocative and suggest that security is actually almost never about security alone. Security is always about something else that we're concerned about. And so I think I was really interesting listening to Amitav's sort of history, and I think it's really important to do that. And I would even push back a little bit further that it used to be that in sort of thinking about global affairs, people didn't separate security and economic issues. They were all kind of wrapped up together. And there was a bit of an evolution, partly in response to the Cold War and the degree to which that kind of took up all the air in the room, and the economists wanted to be able to talk about trade without having to deal with that. And so they moved into their own space, and then security became its own space. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice a little bit by maintaining those boundaries. And I do think that one of the things that I find actually the most important to think about right now is some of the debates about economics, about the future of capitalism on the planet, given the climate crisis, given the change in technology. And I was at a workshop a couple of years ago, charting kind of the future of concerns for the US government, and was really taken by the thoughts of some of my colleagues that things like climate and cyber are not separate issues. They're the world in which we live. We live in a climate challenged world, and we increasingly live in cyberspace. And I think that those two features are actually going to be critical for shaping the things that sort of generate what we see to be security threats going forward. So I very much think that Elizabeth is right in sort of thinking about that, but I would also put the climate crisis right up with it. And I would put kind of the future of economics, capitalism, how we think about how we are interacting. Even the concerns about the pandemic were connected to supply chain issues. It's unclear that the Ukrainians would be able to fight the way they're fighting in Ukraine without the Starlink technology that's kind of allowing them to communicate. So I think that we have to think about these things in a more sort of integrated way. But I do think sort of climate and cyberspace are two important elements that are sort of feeding into how we think about that. And economics kind of underlies a lot of it.
So if I can quickly jump in, very direct answer to Elizabeth's question or issue. To me, technology is a means towards an end, not an end in itself. And it's a double-edged sword, so to speak. It can expand and make security more global, or it can make security more narrow. And the way I look at technological discourses about technology or the use of technology, technology is taking us back towards the national security mindset. Technology can do wonderful things for human security, humanitarian intervention, people security, poverty, economic security, and achieving greater ecological security. But I think the way it is being used in the last maybe 5 years or so, the US-China tech war and the CHIPS Act in the US. So we see technology being used as an instrument more and more of national security and not in the service of human security or a truly global security.
Thank you so much, Amitav. Pinar, would you like to react perhaps on that last point?
On that last point, but also let me answer your question directly about the use of social media and how that may be exacerbating insecurities. I'd like to follow what Deborah was saying here in responding to your question, that security is not just about, is never just about security. It's almost always about something else. What we're really learning, what we've been learning about the history of our discipline tells us about that as well, right? Even when we were not really talking about international security, the study of international relations was about securing a hierarchy in world politics, right? This is also related to what Adam Roberts was saying about, the collapse of empires and the kind of as a challenge. It's a different kind of challenge to different people depending on where they were located in that hierarchy. So let me say that. But also about social media and propaganda. I'm also going to let my day job shape my response here. A lot of what I do is about teaching, right? What worries me about global security as a scholar of international relations is the loss of confidence in knowledge among my students, let alone the bigger world that is out there. We may call it the post-truth condition, but also I'm also worried about the kind of knowledge that we produce about international security, and that people, our students included, are losing their confidence in the kind of knowledge that we produce. So that's one of the things that I would actually identify as one of the biggest challenges to global security these days. We need to start working towards this as well. On the one hand, pay attention to their perspectives, pay attention to what everyone thinks about this, right? But on the other hand, without actually succumbing to relativism, right? That's going to be a difficult balancing act, actually. Pay attention to what others think, what I characterize as those people who also constitute the global, but without making this about relativity of perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Pinar. Adam, would you also like to respond to the observations?
Yeah, just to add that I think technologies have always been important in international relations, the technology of the day, whatever it happened to be. Certainly for the last 4 or 5 centuries, it's been pretty important, both as a source of rivalry and as a phenomenon necessitating cooperation. And I'm very struck that it's more and more self-evident that modern technologies, be it car manufacture, energy, radio communications, medicines, the lot, it all, if left simply to the unfettered operations of the market, in the kind of relation that is wrongly presumed to have been the position of Adam Smith when it wasn't, but the necessity for some degree of control over technological developments has never been more self-evident than it is today. And what worries me is whether we simply are taking that, in some respects, too much for granted, that technical cooperation can go on, even as certain aspects of political cooperation are looking very doubtful. And all of that is true now of, sadly, China's relations with, certainly with the United States, with the UK and Europe as well, that the technical cooperation has been in place in some respects, but it has not led to a more general commitment to cooperation. On the contrary, it seems to have resulted in a great deal of rivalry, some of which is absurd, like the balloons, but some of which is deadly serious. So I think the awareness that technology is very much a two-edged sword is with us, and the awareness that we need to do something about it is with us. But whether that goes far enough is the big question which any thoughts about global security will need to address.
Thank you so much, Adam. Elizabeth, hearing those comments and how, of course, technology has been with us for a long time in different forms, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit further on what you think from the member states' perspective is what is most pressing right now? And also, now we heard from Adam about the need for potentially for control, the relevance of cooperation. Would you say that, for example, statements issued like the ones in Delhi you just mentioned will help us move towards that? Or are we seeing basically a world where there is a stalemate because of the current geopolitical situation where such cooperation is not really possible? I think you need to unmute yourself. Are you able to unmute yourself? Yeah, Ida.
Sorry about this. I'm having my office laptop doesn't like Zoom, so I'm wrestling with the telephone here. Yeah, one of the things I would say about raising this issue is at the moment, and it will come as no surprise to anybody in the room, consensus on issues relating to international security is quite challenging at the Security Council level. And the fact that the member states could come together to agree on this issue, I think is pretty significant. One of the, and I'll go back now to a more sort of purely counterterrorism perspective. I think one of the issues that I see as being problematic is, despite all the massive benefits of new and emerging technologies, and I mean, we can't downplay those. I think its capacity for influencing and being a divisive force is becoming ever more evident, and that's why I mentioned its influence on political crises and social crises. We're seeing the emergence of micro groups and even individuals who are being influenced online, and the divisiveness that it's fueling has real social impact. That I think this has become something that our committee has started to try to understand really for the first time. 20 years ago, we were looking at terrorist groups and pretty specific terrorist groups. The threat has become much more diffuse now. And the terminology that we use to address these threats has changed. With the emergence of, and this is not a term of art in my world, but it's easily understandable, with the emergence of right-wing extremism, for example, and individuals working on their own to commit terrorist acts. It's in that space, and the way in which new and emerging technologies are a means to deliver messages to those kind of groups and individuals that creates a lot of concern.
Thank you so much. I'd like to make sure we can bring in some questions from the audience. So we have here either a Q&A tab, or if no, I'm receiving questions here. So I will ask one from a student here that is related to what we've just heard also about the fact that threats are more diffused. So let me maybe ask, Amitav here. The question is, how is the role of the state changing in light of these new and emerging technologies? And if we think about these different, I guess, linking it to the diffused threats, right, of the activities of armed groups, of criminal groups, but also of these different types of environmental challenges across the cyberstate, where is the role of the state? I mean, thinking also about that tension, right, that we are moving back to these national security concerns. And then another question to Pinar here is, how do we guarantee we can interpret the interests of local actors accurately? So what do we do about that? Again, thinking also about the interconnectedness of those different dimensions, as mentioned by Deborah, but also of the threats. And then another one to Deborah, should we differ between the practice of security and security as a good? And then finally to Adam, what is the role of the quality of these empires or global orders or their normative foundations? If we think about the collapse, of course, what kind of empires are we talking about? And how does the quality then affect security in the wake of its collapse? These are, of course, very easy questions to be tackled within a few minutes, but I'd like to encourage you just to have a go. And of course, as we said, this is a launching roundtable. We're just starting the conversation, but it would be great to hear your thoughts. Amitav, would you like to start?
Yeah. The role of the state is very interesting. So it really depends on which concept of security are we deploying. Historically, the states have always favored national security, international security, even the UN Security Council, which is still a very intergovernmental organization, even though it has discussed climate security and from time to time. The non-state actors, there are two types of non-state actors, the good ones and the bad ones, to put it crudely. So we have terrorists, Al-Qaeda, also non-state actor, and very important in security. I mean, just until 10 years ago, transnational terrorism and Al-Qaeda and Islamic State was the number 1 security threat to the United States, according to US documents. Now, but then there are good NGOs who actually don't like the term national security. They like the term human security. They focus on ecological security, environmental security. In fact, we don't have an environmental security agenda without non-state actors, the good ones, NGOs and the like. So it then depends. I think when you talk about non-state actors, see what security are we talking about? I do still see, despite all the talk about the end of the nation state in the 1990s and 2000s, the state remains a very important actor, but states are more likely to see a lot of things from the national security prism and only cooperate when they have a national security interest at stake, directly at stake. So they securitize even climate change, pandemics, terrorism from a national security angle. The non-state actors go the other way. They challenge the state. They think states are actually threatening the security of the people. And they want securitization, or use the term security, mainly using the human security, the transnational global security term. So it depends on where you stand in this. I mean, if you are working for a government, you will be more sympathetic to the national security approach. If you are part of the NGO community, then you would be looking at human security and global security more as a framing device. And if you are, supporting the terrorists, then you think that the states are also the challenge, but we use very violent means including terrorism, to attack them.
Thank you so much. Pinar, Amitav pointed to the fact that it depends where one stands, right? And of course, also that non-state actors include NGOs, includes local actors. That leads us to the question that was posed to you around how we can actually interpret the interests of local actors. And of course, it also depends a lot on who these local actors are.
Right. Thank you for the question. It is set up in a way that suggests that there is a hierarchy, with me being the person who's going to interpret the local actors who don't have the power to interpret themselves. Right. So let me just point to that. I think, I'm paraphrasing Amitav in his many writings here, globalizing international relations is about treating our contemporaries as knowledge producers. Right. So, of course, there is the risk that depending on where we are located, we are privileged to be able to understand certain insecurities compared to less privileged to be able to make sense of certain other insecurities. Right. So this is not to underestimate the significance of location and our positionality, but I would really hesitate to create a hierarchy between who does the interpretation and who actually is insecure sitting in their home and just not being able to voice those concerns. This links up to the question of technology, which is double-edged, right? It creates insecurities, but it also allows people to voice their concerns and insecurities in a way that their nation states sometimes do not allow us to. Here, look at what was happening in Iran, for instance, or Israel-Palestine. So there is that dimension as well. Again, not to underestimate what Elizabeth was saying, the significance of that here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Perhaps let's continue with Deborah on the question of the practice of security and security as a good. And I'd like to just add here the question that was also posted in the chat by Phil Gittings, where the question is, well, if you could say something about the role of war in the preparations for in relation to global security, that we could also look at, of course, as security as a good. Please.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that sort of a lot, one word that hasn't come up, I don't think, in what we've been talking about, which is interesting, is violence. And a lot of times, we think about security as sort of protecting ourselves from violence. But there's a really good a chapter in a recent Oxford handbook on international security by Keith Krause and Mike Williams, where they talk about many kind of traditional approaches to national security, the kind that Amitav was talking about, as really being about the promotion of advantage rather than the management of violence. And I think that this connects a little bit to the question about how we think about security, as its practice versus security as a good. I think that many times security is used as a rhetorical device to sort of enable the pursuit of advantage in ways that does create hierarchies where some people end up with a lot and some people with much less. And violence is sometimes a response to that. And so I think that, one of the things that's hopeful to me about how we've begun to talk about these issues from this more sort of global perspective is recognizing some of those concerns and maybe not being as quick to assume that militarized response is the one that's going to sort of manage a violent threat the most usefully. And I think that there's a lot of interesting work on that. There's also a lot of interesting practice on the ground of it, of people sort of in their own way, in their own situations, responding to violent situations in ways that manage it more or less productively. At the same time, I agree with Amitav that there has been this kind of resurgence of national security, and I really would tie it to an almost naked pursuit of advantage in ways that makes pretty little sense when we think about sort of the various kinds of global concerns that we might share, and so I sometimes feel like we're in a don't look up, the movie Don't Look Up moment, where there's this very kind of narrow advantage seeking pursuit of national security by some important global players in ways that are not addressing at all some of the sort of more common concerns. And so when I think about security as a good, I am thinking about it as a pursuit of kind of managing common concerns. And I worry that a lot of the attention to on behalf of major players is not looking at the management of common concerns and looking more at the pursuit of individual, and by this I mean state advantage, as opposed to common concerns.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Adam, would you like to respond on the quality of empires?
I think that the question was not guilty to the charge that it was proposing that a research program on global orders become a research program on setting up global empires of an enlightened kind. Although one could read that into the question, or indeed some of you might have been able to read it into my remarks at the beginning because they were so simplified. But yes, I think there's no doubt that global orders have an extraordinary effect on spreading elements of global consciousness and awareness. And just look at the way, for example, that language, certain languages, including English, I'm glad to say, have become quite international in a way that would have been hard to imagine before the 19th century. We do have a world debate and a world civilization of sorts, but it is very easy to fool oneself that because there are elements of commonality in the cultures that we share, therefore international problems are going to go away. On the contrary, what is really striking about any given crisis in the world today is that although we may agree on certain issues as posing crises, and several have been alluded to in this programme, there are genuinely different perspectives about that. And I also think there's a problem in thinking that there can be a smooth transition from a global empire to a more enlightened global order. Because, for example, in the British Empire, frequently there were beginnings of democratic institutions, very plainly in Sri Lanka, for example, universal suffrage and parliamentary body and all that goes with that. But if it is foreign to the culture of the society concerned, it can easily end up being perceived as a threat. Indeed, it's been a problem in Sri Lanka from the 1930s onwards, the extent to which the constitution is really accepted as part of Sri Lanka's inheritance, or is still something that has an element of foreign imposition about it. And one can go on about other cases of similar varieties, getting to understand that there are still different mindsets in this world and still a great deal of suspicion of European powers and European or Western colonialism. Those things are things that need to be faced up to in any conception of global order that we try to advance.
Thank you so much, Adam. I think that kind of also summarized what many others also express, the need to respect different perspectives, or as Pinar said, refraining from creating hierarchies, having a global approach and understanding basically interconnected challenges through those different perspectives. We're almost at the end of the session, but I just would like to pick up the two further questions that were posted in the chat. Perhaps Elizabeth, if you can very briefly speak to one or two of them. So one is by Dr. Isabella Bunn. How do venerable norms of international law, such as state sovereignty, feature in current global security discourse? And the other question is, how would the panelists characterize transnational organized crime in terms of global security? Is the disruption, for example, of maritime supply chain resilience considered a securitized threat by the academic community working on this? So feel free to respond to either of those, Elizabeth, or if anyone else would like to jump in, that's fine as well. Let's see, Elizabeth first. Any quick response?
Just very quickly repeat the first question.
Right. So how do norms of international law, such as state sovereignty, feature in the current global security discourse? And perhaps from your perspective, to what extent does that matter also for the responses?
Well, states, as one of the other speakers pointed out earlier on, I'm working for very much an international, intergovernmental body at the Security Council, and to the extent that they can agree on many issues, that's quite important. In terms of state sovereignty, it's the ability within that intergovernmental environment, I would think, for member states to actually reach consensus through the negotiation and the adoption of treaties and conventions, such as, speaking to your second question, the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. So, I mean, that is, the state sovereignty is always there, of course, but international law is composed of areas where they were able to actually reach some consensus and adopt the relevant international law. Thanks.
I'll just make a very quick point. Norms, having spent a lifetime studying norms are regressing. Global norms at the moment are being contested, but this should not surprise anybody. Norms are always contested. The once a popular idea that in the 1990s that norms are internalized and never contested has been challenged. People like Antia Weiner, for example, have talked about norms are always contested. And my earlier work, norms circulation, norms progress, regress, then come back. So I think the norms of state sovereignty, but humanitarian intervention, R2P, particularly one of the more powerful ideas of the post-Cold War period, are now in regression. But that's not surprise us, because norm creation, norm diffusion is never a linear process, and they might still come back in the future. Let me say that a little optimistically.
Thank you so much, Amitav. I appreciate your optimism also at the end, because I think there has been quite a rather pessimistic line here in terms of where we are in the world. But of course, there are ways of looking at it from a different perspective. And I also hope that there might be some lights in the responses to my next question and final question, just very briefly, because we asked also in advance our speakers if there's any book or publication or podcast that you would recommend to our audience to better understand global security, and hopefully that will bring us more to the positive side. Let's maybe just briefly to end the session, ask you if you have any recommendations. Let's start perhaps with Adam.
I have a recommendation that may seem strange. In 1945, a book was published in Belgrade called The Bridge on the Drina, which was written by a very interesting man, Ivo Andrić, he had Croatian parents, he'd been brought up in Bosnia, he'd become a Serb, he represented a great deal of what was in Yugoslavia. And his book, The Bridge on the Drina, is a subtle, rich account of what it means to be part of an empire, what the problems are, what the divisions are among people, and how they get on with each other despite everything. The Bridge on the Drina is something. There is something eternal about the issues it addresses, and what's more, it's wonderful to find that somebody who worked in the field of international relations can write a really good novel.
Thank you so much, Adam. Deborah, what is your recommendation?
Yeah, I can't choose just one. I have three, but they're joined in some surprising way. The first is a book by Jonathan Kirshner that came out last year called An Unwritten Future. And I love this book because it's coming from a quite kind of realist perspective, and yet it really is, it addresses this issue of uncertainty and the degree to which we really can't tell what's going to happen, and things are continually unfolding. And I would pair it actually with a book by Séverine Autesserre called Frontlines of Peace. And this book is remarkable for someone who's been critiquing the peacekeeping community for a long time, to turn her attention to situations where things seem to have worked. And it's very much a seem to have worked, because they're never perfect. They're always problematic, which is a theme also in Jonathan's book. And yet they're a little bit better than they might have otherwise been. And I think that we sometimes want a sort of, as Adam put it, a smooth transition, and we're actually humans, so we're not likely to get that. And sort of this kind of good enough piece, I really embrace in Severine's work. And then the final one is actually a new book by someone who I was on her dissertation committee, so I feel a little bad prompting her work, but it's by Swati Srivastava, and it's called Hybrid Sovereignty in World Politics. And it's very much a historical account, but I think really connects this degree to which, when we think about sovereignty and we talk about it only in terms of states, we're forgetting all the things underneath it. And I think that as we sort of move into the future, she also, it's a very sort of practice-based account, looking very much at the degree to which things are uncertain and are unwritten, and it's about the process that they unfold that's important. And so I think those three books would be great for anyone to read, to sort of think about productive responses to the future.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Deborah. Pinar, what is your recommendation?
Okay, so I'm going to suggest a series of essays by Siva Grovogi that were recently published in the International Politics Review. It's about the recent war, Russian aggression against Ukraine, and the question that he asks himself is, how should an African respond? There's a podcast that goes with it for those who don't necessarily want to do any more reading. It's the reason that I'm recommending is not because it helps us understand global security better, but it complicates our understanding of global security. To a certain extent, it responds to the question of the relationship between international law, norms, and global security as well. So that's my suggestion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Amitav.
I would start by suggesting to read Keith Krauss and Mike Williams' edited book, Critical Security Studies. I think it was 1990s, but it's really one of the classic texts that brought together a lot of divergent viewpoints and gives you a snapshot of how the concept of security is being redefined. Again, some of the best books on security to me are actually collection of essays or edited books, if they're coherent, because they bring in much more diverse viewpoints than that of a single author. Having said that, I would say security does not a standalone concept. It's deeply embedded in ideas of a world order, a global order, and power. So I don't want to sort of self-advertise too much, but the debate on security from Second World War to the present is well summarized and security and world order in a book I wrote in 2018 with Cambridge University Press called Constructing Global Order. The third one is security and power. That's the most one of the most recent issues of foreign affairs called What is Power? And so it actually looks at how power is changing, but also how security is changing. It's July-August issue of Foreign Affairs. And we have people like Laurie Friedman. In fact, Nairi Woods has an article in there. I myself have an article in there. It sort of gives you a very broad dimension of how security relates to power, because I don't think you can understand security without relating it to global order and the global power shift.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Elizabeth, what is your recommendation?
Hi, thank you. I'm going to recommend the web page, un.org/securitycouncil/CPC that contains our publications. We have a vibrant global research network of which the Global Security Programme is a very active member. And we use our relations with them to produce a number of publications on issues, trends, and developments. A lot of them are what you would expect in terms of legal and criminal justice matters, but we do publish a lot of very thoughtful pieces on role of civil society organizations and security, on gender and violent extremism, on use of proceeds from the trafficking of natural resources, for example, for the purposes of terrorism financing. There's a lot there. So that's what I'm going to recommend. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I hope all the students took notes for their reading list here. Well, this leaves me just with thanking the speakers, the audience members. Next week, we will explore the different methodologies and epistemologies in global security. It will be, the seminar will be 2 hours earlier at noon GMT. So that makes it a little bit tricky for colleagues in some parts of the Americas, but also gives people in Asia the chance to join us live. And of course, we'll also make the conversation available as a podcast on our website. So thank you so much again. Thanks for joining us. Of course, we could have continued, but as we said, this is just the beginning of a longer conversation. It's the opening roundtable of the webinar series. And I very much hope this has sparked lots of interest to think about those issues further. Thank you so much.